The storm hadn't been in any forecast. No emergency alerts. Not even a polite warning from the weather app. Just a sudden, violent tantrum thrown by the sky right over the valley. Wind slammed into the old farmhouse like it held a grudge, shaking the walls, rattling windows, and howling through the trees like something wounded. Rain came down in furious sheets, slapping the glass as if it wanted inside. Inside, Arvin Lock sat by the fireplace, one leg stretched out, a half-empty cup of coffee slowly going cold beside him. He stared into the flames not because they held answers, but because they were warm. And warmth was rare in a house that groaned like it had arthritis. He wasn't scared of storms, just weather, right? But this one felt off, charged, like the universe was inhaling and forgetting to exhale. And Arvin? He was just a guy with a wool blanket, a dying fire, and zero plans to deal with cosmic omens tonight. Then knock, knock. He blinked. Not thunder, not branches, a knock. At his front door, his closest neighbor lived 12 miles and a busted radio signal away. Knock, knock, knock. Arvin stood up slowly, grabbed the old hunting knife from above the mantel just in case Sand made his way to the door. The cold bit into him as he opened it, prepared for a bear, a lunatic, or maybe just a really lost delivery drone. Instead, he got this. Two figures stood in the rain, soaked to the bone, and absolutely not human. The taller one stepped forward, and Arvin's brain short-circuited. She was stunning, ethereal, like a living statue carved from gold and moonlight. Her skin shimmered faintly even in the dim porch light. Her eyes glowed with molten amber, and her silver-blue hair clung to her cheeks in wet strands. She looked like she belonged on a palace balcony, not on his weather-beaten porch. Her clothes were tattered and soaked, but she stood tall, proud, like a queen in exile. Behind her was someone younger, same features, same strange elegance, but where the older woman was regal, the younger one looked ready to fight or flee. "Please," the taller one said. Her voice was soft, melodic, and trembling. "We need shelter. We mean no harm." Arvin hesitated. Every instinct told him this was trouble. Gorgeous, shimmering, alien trouble. And then she collapsed. He caught her without thinking, her body cold and too light in his arms. "Help her!" the younger one cried, panic in her voice. Arvin looked at her, then back at the woman in his arms. Then he sighed. "Get in, both of you." The storm didn't ask for permission. It slammed into the valley like it had a personal vendetta, ripping through the trees and screaming against the old farmhouse walls like some ancient god had finally decided to make a scene. Rain came in sideways sheets, hammering the windows hard enough that Arvin Lock wondered briefly if the whole thing would just fold in on itself. He sat by the fireplace, coffee forgotten and cold, the flames painting restless shadows across the hardwood floor. It wasn't the kind of night for visitors. Then again, it never was not this far from civilization. That's why the knock hit him like a gunshot. Sharp, deliberate, 3 times. Knock, knock, knock. He froze. No one should have been able to reach his place in weather like this. Hell, no one ever came up here when the sun was shining and birds were singing. A second knock followed louder. His hand found the old hunting knife on the mantel, just in case. Not because he expected trouble, but because, well, people only showed up like this if they were trouble. He moved to the door, breath slow, muscles coiled tight. And when he opened it, time stopped. 2 figures stood there, soaked through, shivering from the cold, and very much not from Earth. The first, taller, older, had the kind of beauty that didn't belong in real life. Her skin shimmered gold under the porch light, like she'd been dipped in sunrise. Long, silver-blue hair clung to her face, rainwater tracing rivers down high cheekbones. Even exhausted and drenched, she held herself like a queen chin high, gaze steady. The second was younger, Shorter, but no less striking. Her skin glowed with a gentler hue, her eyes brighter, sharper, curious, and guarded all at once. She hovered half a step behind the older woman, one hand clenched in a fist, the other hovering near a concealed blade at her side. "Please," the tall one said, her voice low and melodic unshaken despite the chill. "We need shelter. We mean no harm." Arvin blinked once, maybe twice. He'd heard stories, rumors, back alley whispers about the Serathians long-lived, hauntingly beautiful, fiercely private. But he'd never seen one. And now there were two standing on his porch, looking like they'd outrun a war and the end of the universe just to land at his door. "Well," he muttered, stepping aside, "come in before the storm decides to finish what it started." He didn't know their names, he didn't know their story. But something in their eyes told him whatever it was, he was already part of it. The fire hadn't lost its bite. Even after the storm calmed and the front door shut behind them, the wind still whispered through the warped seams of the farmhouse walls like it had unfinished business. Rain tapped against the windows, softer now, like it had gotten bored of screaming. Velmira sat on the old couch, her soaked clothes leaving dark patches on the fabric. A heavy wool blanket wrapped around her like armor that didn't quite fit. Steam rose from the cup of tea in her hands, Arvin's strongest blend. Real leaves, no synth. The kind you only brewed for someone when you weren't sure if they needed comfort or grounding. She sipped it slowly, her golden eyes tracking the fire, but not really seeing it. Across the room, the younger one Silna paced like a caged storm, her arms crossed tight, every step sharp. She hadn't touched her tea, probably didn't trust it, or him, maybe both. Arvin stood in the kitchen doorway, back to the wall, hands in his pockets like that would make him look less like a threat. "I'm Arvin," he said finally, breaking the silence. His voice low, calm. "Arvin Lock." Velmira nodded once, slow. Her lips parted, voice soft enough to vanish if the fire cracked too loud. "Velmira." She hesitated, then tilted her head toward the younger one. "My daughter, Silna." Silna didn't look up, just stopped pacing long enough to throw him a glance sharp enough to draw blood. "Don't get comfortable," she said. "We're not staying long." "Didn't think you were," Arvin replied, the corner of his mouth twitching. "You're not exactly the buy property type." A flicker of something passed over her face. Not quite amusement, not quite disdain, just a flash of surprise that he'd snapped back. She turned her eyes back to the window, watching the shadows dance beyond the glass. Velmira cleared her throat quiet, like a note played too gently on a forgotten instrument. "We're not here to cause harm. Just needed to disappear for a while." Arvin didn't ask from what. The look in her eyes made it clear the answer wouldn't be short or painless. "You picked a good place for that," he said. "Out here, even the crows forget how to find you." She smiled faintly. There was warmth in it, but something else too. Sadness maybe, or memory. Silna moved again, this time toward the fire, but she didn't sit. Just stood near enough to warm her fingers, still refusing to relax. Her stance was wrong, too practiced, too aware of exits. This girl wasn't just running, she was ready to fight. Arvin watched her carefully. He'd seen soldiers move like that. People with damage baked deep into the bones. People who hadn't been safe in a long, long time. "So," he said, voice steady, "what the hell happened to you two?" Velmira looked up. Her eyes met his'n for a heartbeat. The storm outside didn't feel so far away anymore. "We escaped," she said, "from someone who doesn't let things go." Silna scoffed under her breath. "From her people, not mine." Velmira's eyes didn't waver, but something in her jaw tensed. She didn't argue, just folded her hands over the tea and stared at the flame again. "He was my bondmate," she said quietly. "A Serathian lord. He betrayed us. We fled." Arvin didn't speak. He didn't need to. The story was all over her, face etched in the small tremors in her fingers, in the way her voice tried to sound neutral and failed. The fire popped sharply. Silna flinched barely, but Arvin caught it. "Look," Silna said suddenly, voice too loud for the quiet room. "Just let us stay a few nights. We'll move on after that." She met his gaze head on, defiant, daring him to say no. "You can stay," Arvin said, "as long as you need." Even he was surprised by how fast the words came out. Velmira's breath caught just a little. Her shoulders eased, and for a moment, the lines on her face softened. "Thank you," she said, and when she said his name, Arvin Lock, it felt like more than just a label, like a key turning quietly in an old, rusted lock. Silna made a noise in her throat. "Don't think this makes us friends, human. Wouldn't dream of it." And for the first time in a very long time, Arvin felt something stir under his ribs. Not fear, not caution. Something older, something dangerous. The storm had passed, but it left a silence that felt heavier than the thunder. The farmhouse breathed slow, again warm air, thick with the scent of old wood, steeping tea, and something faintly metallic, like the edge of a memory no one wanted to touch. Velmira sat curled on the worn couch, legs folded beneath her, the blanket draped over one shoulder like a cloak. She wasn't shaking anymore, just still. The kind of stillness that came from someone who'd been moving for too long and didn't quite know what to do when the running stopped. Her eyes were on the flames, but not watching them. Not really. Her gaze drifted like someone looking through time, not at it. Arvin leaned against the kitchen counter, arms crossed, trying to read her without looking like he was. Silna was nowhere to be seen. "She's scouting the perimeter," Velmira said softly, without turning. It startled him, the way she just knew. "Still doesn't trust me, huh?" "She doesn't trust anyone, not anymore." A pause, long, measured. The fire snapped gently between them. "And you?" Arvin asked. "Do you trust me?" Velmira finally looked at him. Her eyes were different in the firelightless gold, more amber, soft and ancient, like they'd seen stars collapse in King's Fall. When she spoke again, her voice was a whisper through velvet. "I trust that you're tired of being alone." That hit deeper than it should have. Arvin cleared his throat, looked away. Suddenly, the ceiling beam over the stove was fascinating. "You're not wrong." Velmira smiled, but it was thin, almost sad. She shifted, unwrapping her hands from around the teacup and setting it down with care like it might shatter if she wasn't gentle enough. "Do you know what it means to be claimed, Arvin? Not romantically, not symbolically, but politically." He raised an eyebrow, watching her now. "Back on Serathis," she continued, "a lord can bind someone to them, not through love, through utility." Her hands rested in her lap, fingers interwoven like silk knots. "Zalith bound me because I was beautiful and quiet and obedient. I made him look like a man of wisdom and restraint. And when I stopped being useful..." She didn't finish the sentence, didn't need to. He threatened Silna. Arvin swallowed hard. "That's why you ran." Velmira's gaze didn't flinch. "I didn't run. I tore my name from the registry and burned every bond code that tied me to him. That's not escape. That's rebellion." The wind outside stirred again, brushing the walls like something listening in. Arvin exhaled slowly. "That's one hell of a rebellion." Velmira smiled again, but this time it reached her eyes. A queen without a throne, a fugitive with a daughter who's more fire than sense, and now... She looked around the humble room, then back at him. "Now I'm a guest in a house built by a man who talks to fire more than people." He chuckled, low and quiet. "The fire listens better than most." She tilted her head, curious. "And if I ask for something more than just shelter?" Arvin froze, not entirely sure what she meant. Not entirely sure she didn't mean what he thought. "Like what?" Velmira's voice was softer now, but clearer than before. No trembling, just truth. I don't want to feel like a weapon he discarded, or a trophy someone else gets to dust off and hide. She rose slowly, stepping toward him. I want to feel wanted. Not claimed, not used, just wanted. And when she stopped in front of him, inches apart, she didn't move further. She just waited. Not demanding. Not begging. Just offering. The silence was louder than the storm had ever been. She didn't reach for him. She just stood there close enough to share breath, but not enough to steal it. Waiting, not testing him, not teasing, but leaving space. A kind of silence bloomed between them. Not awkward, not strained, just thick with the things they hadn't said and didn't dare to name yet. Arvin's pulse slowed, but somehow everything felt louder. The ticking of the old clock on the wall, the hiss of wind sneaking under the warped floorboards, the whisper of flame shifting in the hearth. He looked at her, really looked. Not just the shimmering skin or the impossible eyes, but the curve of her collarbone as the blanket slipped from her shoulder. The way she breathed, calm, steady, but ready to shatter. You sure about this? He asked, voice low, raw at the edges. Velmira tilted her head. Her expression didn't change, but her voice, it was softer than anything the farmhouse had heard in years. I'm sure I don't want to feel alone in this body anymore. That was all it took. He stepped forward, not lunging, not rushing, but answering. Like gravity, not decision. Their lips met with the kind of hesitation that came from two people still wounded, still unsure if they deserved softness. But once they found each other, the hesitation melted like ice under fire. Her hands found the edges of his shirt, slow, careful, reverent, not desperate. He helped her shrug the blanket off. It fell to the floor like fog lifting. Golden skin in firelight, unreal, radiant, and yet so human in the way she trembled when he touched her bare shoulder. They didn't rush. There was no urgency here. Only understanding. He kissed down the line of her neck, and she breathed in sharp and slow, her fingers curling at the nape of his neck like she wasn't sure whether to pull him closer or memorize every second of this moment. Outside, the wind howled like it had just lost a battle. It didn't know it was fighting. The couch creaked beneath their weight as they sank into each other, not from lust, but from release. A surrender, finally, to something that didn't hurt. She whispered his name against his ear, voice cracking in a way that had nothing to do with pleasure and everything to do with trust. And when she pulled him down to her, hands sliding along the small of his back, he realized this wasn't about claiming or conquering. It was restoration. Two survivors tangled in blankets and shadow, trying to believe that maybe, just maybe, they hadn't been ruined by the past after all. Hours passed in the hush of firelight and breath. And somewhere beyond the wall, a quiet presence watched unseen but not unaware. Silna. Her back pressed to the wall just beyond the hallway, her fists clenched at her sides. She didn't cry. She didn't move. She just listened. And when she finally turned away, there was something strange in her expression. Not anger. Not sadness. She didn't reach for him. She just stood there close enough to share breath, but not enough to steal it. Waiting, not testing him, not teasing, but leaving space. A kind of silence bloomed between them. Not awkward, not strained, just thick with the things they hadn't said and didn't dare to name yet. Arvin's pulse slowed, but somehow everything felt louder. The ticking of the old clock on the wall, the hiss of wind sneaking under the warped floorboards, the whisper of flame shifting in the hearth. He looked at her, really looked. Not just the shimmering skin or the impossible eyes, but the curve of her collarbone as the blanket slipped from her shoulder. The way she breathed, calm, steady, but ready to shatter. You sure about this? He asked, voice low, raw at the edges. Velmira tilted her head. Her expression didn't change, But her voice, it was softer than anything the farmhouse had heard in years. I'm sure I don't want to feel alone in this body anymore. That was all it took. He stepped forward, not lunging, not rushing, but answering. Like gravity, not decision. Their lips met with the kind of hesitation that came from two people still wounded, still unsure if they deserve softness. But once they found each other, the hesitation melted like ice under fire. Her hands found the edges of his shirt. Slow, careful, reverent, not desperate. He helped her shrug the blanket off. It fell to the floor like fog lifting. Golden skin in firelight, unreal, radiant, and yet so human in the way she trembled when he touched her bare shoulder. They didn't rush. There was no urgency here, only understanding. He kissed down the line of her neck, and she breathed in sharp and slow, her fingers curling at the nape of his neck, like she wasn't sure whether to pull him closer or memorize every second of this moment. Outside, the wind howled like it had just lost a battle it didn't know it was fighting. The couch creaked beneath their weight as they sank into each other, not from lust, but from release. A surrender, finally, to something that didn't hurt. She whispered his name against his ear, voice cracking in a way that had nothing to do with pleasure and everything to do with trust. And when she pulled him down to her, hands sliding along the small of his back, he realized this wasn't about claiming or conquering. It was restoration. Two survivors, tangled in blankets and shadow, trying to believe that maybe, just maybe, they hadn't been ruined by the past after all. Hours passed in the hush of firelight and breath. And somewhere beyond the wall, a quiet presence watched unseen but not unaware. Silna, her back pressed to the wall just beyond the hallway, her fists clenched at her sides. She didn't cry. She didn't move. She just listened. And when she finally turned away, there was something strange in her expression. Not anger, not sadness. Morning came late, as if the sun had hesitated before rising. The rain had stopped, but the mist lingered draped over the fields like a forgotten veil. The farmhouse sat in it quietly, like it knew something had changed during the night and wasn't sure how to feel about it. Arvin moved through the kitchen in silence, shirt half-buttoned, eyes unfocused, movements automatic. The old kettle hissed gently on the stove, steam coiling like smoke from a dream he hadn't quite shaken off. The couch where they'd slept was empty now, the blanket half-folded, a whisper of warmth left in the cushions. Velmira was gone, but her presence lingered not just in the room but in him. In the weight behind his ribs, in the ache that wasn't regret but something close. He didn't hear her footsteps. Silna had always moved like a predator, pretending to be polite. She stood in the doorway, hair damp, arms crossed, eyes unreadable. "Busy night," she said. Her voice wasn't sharp, not mocking, just flat, measured. She was weighing every syllable before she let it go. Arvin didn't turn, just reached for 2 mugs and set them on the counter. "Didn't mean for you to hear anything." "I didn't hear anything," she lied. "I listened." He paused. Not because he didn't know what to say, but because everything he could say would be wrong. She stepped inside, slowly, like the room might bite her. The kettle whined. He poured the tea. Steam rose again, caught in the morning light like threads of memory. Silna didn't take the cup. She stood on the other side of the table, eyes locked on his, expression almost too calm. "You love her?" Arvin met her gaze, steady but cautious. "Yeah, I think I do." "And what about me?" She didn't blink. Her voice didn't rise. It was almost gentle, which made it worse. "You barely know me, Silna." "No," she said, stepping closer. "You just think you do." She stopped within arm's reach. "You see her scars, the ones she lets you see. And that's noble, that's safe, but you don't look at me long enough to see anything." Her hand rose slow and pressed flat against his chest. Just over his heart, her fingers trembled barely. I'm not a child. The words weren't defensive. They were tired, quiet, heavy. Arvin's breath hitched. He looked down into her eyes. They were different now. Not fire, but smoldering ash. Not wild, wounded. You were listening last night. Why? Because I wanted to know what it sounded like to be wanted. Her hand dropped. And now I know. She turned, slow, controlled, but there was a stiffness in her shoulders that hadn't been there before. At the doorway, she stopped. If you're going to love someone, Arvin Lock. She looked back just once. Make sure they're not the only one burning. Then she was gone. The screen door clicked shut behind her. And Arvin stood alone in the misted kitchen, heart pounding like he'd just survived a crash he hadn't seen coming. The woods didn't welcome people like her. Too quiet, too open, too alive in the wrong kind of way. Silna moved through the underbrush with that same fluid, sharp grace she always had, like the forest wasn't real enough to touch her unless she let it. Dew clung to her boots, to her legs, to her thoughts. She hated mornings, hated silence, but most of all, she hated feeling anything she didn't choose to feel. Birds called to each other in the canopy above, innocent, oblivious. She wanted to scream just to remind the world she was still here. But she didn't. She stopped by the river, where the water cut cold and silver through the dark earth. It rushed forward without asking where it was going, and for some reason, that felt like a threat. Silna crouched beside the bank and stared into the current. Her reflection looked back at her, ghost-like, fractured. She didn't recognize the girl in the water, not anymore. He sees her, she whispered to no one, but he doesn't see me. She didn't cry. She'd done enough of that back when running had been her only skill, and fear had been the only language spoken in her bones. But anger was safer. She scooped a stone and hurled it into the water with a sharp grunt. It vanished instantly, swallowed without a ripple, as if the river had been waiting to erase something. Behind her, twigs snapped. She didn't turn. She didn't have to. You followed me, she said flatly. Arvin stopped a few paces back, breath uneven, shoulders tense. His jacket was damp with morning fog, hair a mess, eyes tired and guilty. I had to, he answered. Silna stood slowly, not looking at him. Her arms crossed again, more shield than gesture. Because you care? He didn't reply right away. The river kept talking in his silence. I don't know what I feel, he finally said, but I know what I did. I hurt you. You didn't owe me anything, she muttered, voice quieter now. Maybe not, Arvin admitted, stepping closer, but you didn't deserve silence either. She turned her head, just enough to see him from the corner of her eye. The wind tugged at her hair. Her face was unreadable somewhere between pride and pain. You think I'm just some firebrand rebel girl who doesn't know what she wants? No, he said. I think you know exactly what you want. I think that's why you're terrifying. That made her lips twitch. Not quite a smile, not quite a snarl, just something alive. He stepped closer, slowly, like walking through sacred ground. I never meant to choose between you two. But you did. The words didn't accuse, they just were. Arvin looked down, nodded. No excuses, no defense, just truth. I chose safety. And I'm not safe, Silna finished. He looked up. Their eyes met fully, now nothing left to hide behind. No, he said, you're not, you're real, and that scares the hell out of me. Something in her chest loosened, not healed, not whole, but shifted. She stepped toward him, slow, deliberate. Her boots crunched wet leaves, and the air between them felt tight enough to snap. So what now, Arvin Lock? Her voice was low, not angry, not desperate, just bare. You kissed my mother, slept in her arms, and I watched. And then I left, she added. But I'm here now, and I'm not running. She closed the last step between them and placed her palm over his chest again, right where his heart still thudded too loud for this kind of quiet. So tell me, do you only have room for her? His throat tightened, his breath caught. And in that single moment before either of them spoke again, the river seemed to hold its current. The wind paused mid-song, and somewhere deep in the forest, something unseen listened. She didn't come back with him. Not right away. Silna stayed behind at the river, still barefoot in the moss, like the forest might answer a question he hadn't been brave enough to ask. Arvin didn't push it, didn't speak, didn't turn around until the air behind him stopped holding her shape. By the time he stepped back inside the farmhouse, the fire had gone cold. The room hadn't changed, but it felt different, like the walls had overheard something they weren't sure how to keep secret. Velmira sat at the edge of the bed, not resting, not asleep, just waiting. Her hands folded neatly in her lap, her silver blue hair pulled back into a braid that looked too tight for comfort. The soft robe she wore shimmered faintly in the low light, simple, but not casual. She looked up when he entered. Not startled, not angry, just watchful. You were gone a while, she said quietly. Arvin didn't answer. His boots thudded softly against the floorboards as he crossed to the table, setting his mug down with a dull clink. Velmira studied him the way a surgeon studies a wound she already knows how to close. She kissed you. It wasn't a question. He turned, slowly. Yeah, he admitted. I kissed her too. The air between them tightened. Not violent, not explosive. Just still. The kind of stillness that comes right before a tide changes shape. Velmira looked away, not to avoid his gaze but to keep hers from unraveling. I always knew, she murmured, fingers tightening in her lap. From the first night, the way she watched you, the way you kept pretending not to notice. Arvin moved closer, slowly, like a man crossing a bridge already on fire. I didn't plan any of this. No, she said, eyes returning to his. But you let it happen. Silence folded around them again, thick as smoke. Do you love her? The question landed heavier than it should have. He closed his eyes. I didn't want to. But you do. He opened them. It's not the same. What I feel for you, it's deeper, quieter, something that makes me want to stop running. And with her, it's louder, he said, like I might break if I don't hold it. Velmira stood, graceful, silent, unshaken, at least on the surface. She crossed to him, slow and deliberate, and placed her hand on his chest, just like Silna had done hours ago. Then hold both. His brow furrowed. What? I'm not human, Arvin. Her voice was low now, but steady. Not cold, not bitter, just real. You see love as a ladder-own step, one path. But ours is a constellation. We feel things differently, we're allowed to. He stared at her, unsure if she was forgiving him or asking him to confess more. You're not angry? Of course I'm angry, she said softly, fingers curling into his shirt. But I'm also tired of choosing survival over feeling. A breath passed between them. I won't fight her for you, she said, but I won't leave you either. If she stays, I stay. Her eyes shimmered then, not with tears, but with resolve. Not because I accept it, but because I'd rather share the pieces than let go of them all. The room seemed to shift with those words. The walls relaxed. The floor exhaled. Even the firewood creaked faintly, like it had been listening too. And outside, in the dark beyond the porch, a single light blinked in the trees. Not lightning, not wind. A signal, far off. Watching, waiting. The light didn't blink again. Not right away. It hovered far off in the tree line, just long enough to make Arvin question if he'd imagined it. A single flicker. Cold, mechanical, out of place. And then it was gone. The stars above were too quiet. Velmira had gone still again, her fingers still touching his shirt, her eyes trained on something beyond the walls. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. You saw it too. It wasn't a question. She nodded once, small, sharp, eyes narrowing just enough to hint at calculation. He's found us. She didn't say the name, didn't need to. Zalith. The name hung there like poison in the air, even unspoken. Arvin moved toward the front door without thinking, pulling it open fast enough to make the old hinges wail. Cool night air spilled in. Mist rolled across the grass in thin sheets, stirred by nothing, shaped by something. No birds. No bugs. No wind. Too quiet. The kind of quiet nature didn't invent on its own. Silna's still out there, he muttered. He barely got 2 steps off the porch before Velmira was beside him, her robe trailing like vapor. Her hand grabbed his arm tight, firm, not pleading. She's not helpless. I didn't say she was. But you think she'll break if she sees what's coming. The tension between them stretched, thin at fear. Not yet, but the shape of it. He pulled free, but not roughly. She deserves to choose how she breaks. Velmira didn't follow. Didn't argue. She just whispered something in a language Arvin didn't recognize, a soft ripple of vowels that felt like both a curse and a prayer. The trees loomed ahead, dark and jagged, their branches twitching like fingers reaching for something just out of frame. He stepped into them anyway. Silna heard him before she saw him. She was crouched behind a fallen log, eyes scanning the treetops, jaw tight, breath held in that way soldiers do when their instincts say, "Don't move, just feel." She didn't turn when his boots hit the earth behind her. "You saw it too," she said flatly. "Yeah." She finally turned her head. Her eyes looked sharper than before, less wounded, more prepared. "They're close. You think it's just scouts?" "No," she said. "I think it's Zalith, and I think he brought more than ships." A pause. The kind that didn't breathe. "I think he brought judgment." Back at the house, the fireplace sparked on its own. A pulse, then another. Not flame, not heat. A shimmer of energy rippling up the stone like the house itself was reacting to something outside the physical. Velmira stood in front of it now, her hands open at her sides, her breath steadying into an old rhythm. A ritual, not a panic. She didn't fear Zalith. She knew him, and the worst part was, she knew what he would do to make a point. Outside, as Arvin and Silna scanned the horizon, a shape shifted behind the trees, tall, lean, unmoving. Eyes if they were eyes gleamed silver blue, watching, calculating, waiting for something, or someone. The light came back, not blinking this time, just steady, unmoving. A cold white glare suspended high above the Trelanino flicker, no flicks of drone exhaust, no sound. It wasn't meant to be seen, which meant it wanted to be. Silna stood still, her breath shallow, shoulders tight, like she was trying to become smaller than the trees. "That's not a scout beacon," she said. Arvin didn't answer. Couldn't. His eyes stayed locked on the sky where the light pulsed, slow and deliberate, like a heartbeat that didn't belong to anything human. "He knows where we are," she whispered. "He wants us to see him coming." The forest wasn't moving. It hadn't for minutes now. No rustle, no creak, no wildlife in retreat. Even the wind had vanished, like the air itself had taken shelter. This was no longer Earth's forest. It belonged to him now. Back at the farmhouse, Velmira knelt before the hearth, hands placed palm down on the stone floor. Her eyes were shut, but her breathing had shifted deeper, older, laced with syllables no Terran throat could form. The fireplace pulsed again, then again, faster now. Not fire, not heat, A memory. A message. He's inside the lattice, she breathed. The stones beneath her fingers trembled only slightly, like they remembered her touch from long ago. She could feel his presence now, like the echo of a hand around her throat that hadn't yet tightened. He wants to pull me back into orbit, into obedience. He doesn't understand. I already died in that palace. She opened her eyes. They didn't glow. They burned. In the woods, the light above began to descend. Slow. Controlled. A disk sleek and unadorned slid between the trees like a blade through mist. No sound, no hum, just pressure. Atmospheric weight folding around it like gravity was remembering something too late. Arvin and Silna ducked behind the ridge of a dry riverbed. The ship, if it could still be called that, floated 10 meters above ground, lights cutting gentle swaths of silver through the undergrowth. He's not sending soldiers, Silna whispered. He's sending himself. To collect us? To prove he still owns what he lost. She turned to him, her eyes no longer guarded, just resigned. If I go with him, he'll spare the house, spare you. He won't, Arvin said. He'll burn everything just to watch us beg. Silna's throat moved as she swallowed. Then we don't beg. Velmira stepped out onto the porch. No cloak. No robe. Just her. Barefoot. Tall. Unmoving. The sky above her lit up not with stars, but with machinery masquerading as gods. She didn't flinch. She raised her hand, fingers splayed, palm up a call. A warning, a promise. You want to see me kneel again? She said softly. Come take me. The air shifted. The ship paused. Something inside it pulsed back. Not light. Not sound. A voice. Inside her skull. Inside her spine. It said her name wrong. Deliberately. Property. Recalled. But Velmira only smiled. It wasn't kind. Or sad. It was the smile of a woman who had nothing left to fear. And when Arvin and Silna emerged from the trees behind her, dirt-streaked and furious, they stood not as her defense, but as her witnesses. Because if Zalith had come for ownership, he was about to learn what happens when the things you claim learn how to choose. The light didn't grow louder. It grew deeper. Like it wasn't shining, but pressing into bone, into thought, into memory. The kind of pressure that had nothing to do with gravity and everything to do with ownership. Velmira stood barefoot on the porch, arms at her sides, shoulders back. Unmoving. Unbroken. But her fingers twitched just once. A reflex her body hadn't unlearned yet. Not fear, not pain. Recognition. The voice came again. Not aloud, not external. It moved behind her teeth, in the marrow of her jaw, inside the old scar on the inside of her wrist where Zalith's seal used to rest. Return, comply, restoration pending. I am not yours, she whispered. The stars did not blink. The ship did not answer. But the voice did. It surged through her, a chemical memory, dredging up names she hadn't spoken since she still believed in thrones and fate. You were made to kneel. You were made to obey. Silna heard nothing. She only saw her mother falter just for half a second. Her posture dipped, her breathing changed. It was small, almost invisible. But Silna had watched her stand like stone in war zones. That twitch meant more than 1,000 words. She reached for her blade worn from years of running, the hilt scorched, the edge uneven. Say the word, she said low, and I'll burn the sky. Arvin stood beside her, his hands curled into fists. Not in rage, in restraint. Because if Zalith saw rage, he'd take it as proof of ownership. If he saw calm, he might start to doubt. Don't show him anything he can name, Arvin muttered. He only knows how to use what he recognizes. Silna glanced sideways at him. When did you get smart? About 3 seconds after I fell for a girl who growls when she kisses. She almost smiled. Almost. But the light above them shifted, and the thing inside the ship stepped out. It wasn't Zalith. Not yet. Not fully. It wore a body humanoid, tall, armored in something that looked like living bone and gilded thread. No face. Just a smooth black surface where features should be, etched with lines of gold that pulse like veins. But the voice, that voice was him, Velmira. It said her name like a verdict. Not a greeting. You are damaged. You are ours. You will be made useful again. The figure raised its hand. No weapon. Just 5 slender fingers glowing faintly at the tips. Arvin stepped forward without thinking. Touch her and I break you. You speak, the voice said with vague amusement. How quaint. You assume she's yours because you once had her collar, Arvin growled. But you don't even see the person, just the packaging. The figure tilted its head. She was perfected, now degraded. Silna moved faster than anyone expected, sword drawn, booted feet thudding into the moss as she closed the distance. Then here's your refund. She struck low aim for the knee joint. The blade passed through. Not metal. Not flesh. Just light. And then she was thrown, back no impact, no force, just lifted off her feet by something her body couldn't explain. She hit the ground hard, breath gone. The figure turned to Velmira again. One more attempt at defiance, and I stripped the womb from your line. The world held still. Velmira breathed in, and her eyes changed. Not color. Structure. The pupils narrowed to slits. The gold deepened to burnished metal. Something ancient in her genes woke up, not Serathian nobility. Serathian fury. Then try, she said. Her voice shook the porch boards. The figure paused. Because Zalith might have owned her once. But he forgot what he built her from. And now? She remembered. The figure didn't move. Didn't speak. Just stood there, bathed in artificial starlight, faceless and silent. But the pressure in the air had changed. The dirt beneath Velmira's feet tightened, like it was bracing for something that hadn't happened in generations. Silna lay in the brush, blinking back stars, ribs aching where the force had bent her. Arvin stood between her and the creature now, not out of strategy, but instinct. A useless gesture, maybe, but human ones often were. He's testing you, Velmira said aloud, not to Arvin, not to Silna, to herself, to the ghost still speaking through the machine, trying to decide if I'm salvageable. The figure raised its hand again, same motion, same glow. But this time, Velmira stepped forward. No hesitation. No permission. You want obedience? She said. Her bare feet met the grass with a sound like thunder too small to be real. But the world heard it anyway. You want compliance? Then look into me and try to find it. She opened her mind, not metaphorically, not magically, literally. A pulse of light erupted around her temples. Faint but deliberate, a visible surge through the gold-laced neural lattice burned beneath her skull. Ancient tech, forbidden, locked away after the rebellions. It had always been there, dormant, waiting. The voice inside the figure stuttered. Unauthorized interface, corrupted signature, lineage irregularity. It faltered. Access denied. But Velmira was already inside. She stepped into the projection, into the construct Zalith had sent and ripped it open from the inside like a woman tearing the mask off a memory. The light exploded outward. No fire. No sound. Just the shattering silence of psychic displacement. When it cleared, the figure was gone. All that remained was the armor cracked, empty, flickering faintly, steaming where her energy had split it apart. It looked like it had knelt before dying. Velmira stood over it, breath heavy, eyes unfocused. Her body trembled, not from fear but from the cost. She swayed. Arvin caught her before she hit the ground. Her skin was too hot, like something that had held lightning too long. "You stayed," she whispered. "Always," he said. Silna stumbled up beside them, blood at her lip, fury in her breath. "Was that him?" "A piece of him," Velmira said. "He won't send another piece. Next time, he'll come himself." The porch creaked as they carried her inside. The fire rekindled on its own, a slow blue burn this time, cold at the edges. Watching, remembering. Outside, the ship fragment flickered once, then vanished, not broken, recalled. The message had been delivered. So had the warning. This was no longer about escape. It was about what she had become, and the choice they'd all have to make when Zalith came to collect what he thought was still his. Maybe it wasn't the storm that changed everything. Maybe it was the moment he opened the door. Not out of bravery, but because something deep inside him was finally tired of being alone. And from a quiet, forgotten house where only wind and old wood used to speak, a family began to take shape. Not through blood, but through choice. Through accidental touches, stolen glances, and feelings none of them were prepared to handle. But still, can Luveno matter how real stand against what's coming? Zalith hasn't shown his face yet, and the question still hangs in the dark. What's the next thing that comes knocking? If you ever believed the human heart was fragile, stay. Follow this story to its edge. Because sometimes, the things we fail to hold on to are the very things that make us dangerous. And in the last breath of that storm, there was a whisper, not a voice, just a sound, coiled in thunder like a forgotten promise. Next time, I'll come myself.